Being the person everyone relies on is slowly destroying you. And I'm going to bet that nobody's noticed, maybe not even you. Because from the outside, you look capable. You look like someone who has it all together. But underneath that, you're running on a kind of exhausted that doesn't go away after a good night's sleep. Because the emotional load doesn't stop when you do. That's not just tiredness, that's a pattern. And it has a huge impact on your mental health unless you know what to do about it. So let's talk about the cost of carrying too much. Hello, I'm Jeremy Godwin, and this is the Let's Talk About Mental Health podcast, full of practical advice to help you understand and improve your mental health. Today's episode is for those of you who keep everything running, whether that's at home or at work or in your relationships, and it's especially for you if you ever find yourself quietly wondering how much longer you can keep holding everything together and everyone without running out of steam or breaking entirely. And the reason why I want to talk about this today is because that combination of being indispensable on the outside while struggling on the inside is one of the most common yet invisible forms of suffering there is. And usually nobody sees it because you're too good at making it all look effortless. And it's even quite possible that you might not even fully see it yourself yet. But what it is overfunctioning, and it can do a lot of harm to your mental health and well-being in the long term. So what we're going to cover today is what overfunctioning actually is, why it's so hard to slow down or stop even when you're exhausted, and what you can actually do about it, in ways that are realistic for someone who's already stretched thin and doesn't have the luxury of a 6-week yoga retreat to figure themselves out. To be clear, this isn't about doing less for the sake of it. It's about understanding what's driving the pattern, because that's where the real work is, and that's where real change becomes possible. Now, before we get into that deeper stuff, I want to give you something simple to work with right now. If you're someone who carries a lot, and I'm guessing you probably are, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here, then I want you to try something this week, just once. So when you notice yourself about to take something on without thinking, just pause for 3 seconds before you do. Don't say yes yet. Don't jump in. Just pause. Now, I'm not asking you to say no. There's no commitment here. You're just creating a tiny little gap between the moment and your response. Because that gap is where choice lives. And right now, for a lot of you who tend to overfunction, that gap doesn't exist at all. But it can be built one small step at a time. So let's dig a bit deeper and let's talk about what is overfunctioning. So let me clarify what I'm actually talking about, because overfunctioning is one of those terms that sounds really clinical, but it actually describes something very human and very recognizable. Overfunctioning means consistently doing more than your share, like anticipating the needs of others before they say them out loud, solving problems before they become a crisis, managing the emotional and practical load of a household or a relationship or a team or a family in ways that often go completely unseen. It could be at home, it could be at work, anyway. It's the person who remembers every appointment, every deadline, every preference, the one who notices when something's about to go wrong and quietly fixes it before anyone else even registers the potential problem. The one who, if they stopped doing what they do, would immediately reveal just how much they were actually doing, because suddenly nothing would get done. And invisible labor is the specific name for the work that sits underneath all of that. It's not just the doing. It's all the mental load that comes with that. The thinking, the planning, the anticipating, the coordinating, the remembering. It's the mental load of running a life or several lives or keeping things on track for a whole group of people, like at work. And it's the stuff that nobody sees because it all happens inside your head. It's invisible, not because it doesn't exist, but because it never gets named or counted or acknowledged. And when work is invisible, it tends to stay that way because you can't ask for help with something that nobody knows is happening. Now, what does this actually feel like from the inside? Well, it feels like being permanently switched on. Like you can never fully relax because there's always something you're monitoring, something you're managing, something you're holding in the back of your mind just in case. It feels like being the only adult in the room, even when there are other adults around. It feels like exhaustion that you can't quite explain, because on paper, you're just living your life. But in reality, you're living your life plus everyone else's, and you're quietly disappearing amongst all of your responsibilities. It often comes with a low-level hum of resentment that you might feel a bit guilty about because you love these people or you care about them, or if it's at work, you chose this job, right? Nobody forced you. And so the resentment feels unfair, which makes you push it down, which means that it never gets addressed, which means the overfunctioning continues. It's a pattern. And people often mistakenly think it's a choice that you're making, that you just like being in control, or you're a perfectionist, or you just can't trust anyone else to do things properly. And sometimes there's a grain of truth to that. Let's not pretend that there isn't. But the deeper reality is that for most people who overfunction, it stopped being a choice a long time ago. It became automatic. It became your identity. The question stopped being, should I take this on? And instead it became, of course I'll take this on because that's what I do. And that's where things get complicated. Because when your function becomes your identity, stopping feels dangerous and maybe even impossible. Because being the one who holds it all together becomes who you are, rather than just what you do. And so it feels like a threat to your sense of self. Which is why willpower alone will never change this type of pattern. You are not going to think your way out of a pattern that runs that deep. You need to understand it first. One more thing before we continue, and this really matters. Overfunctioning and hyperindependence are closely linked. So hyperindependence is the often unconscious belief that relying on others is dangerous or weak or simply not going to work out. It's the I'll just do it myself reflex that kicks in before you've even considered asking for help. And if you grew up in an environment where asking for help wasn't safe or where adults weren't reliable, then hyperindependence isn't a personality quirk. It's a survival response that has well and truly outlived its original purpose. If that feels familiar to you, then I explore it in a lot more detail in episode 336 about feeling like a burden. So check that out after this one, and it's linked in the description. All right, so with all of that in mind, now we need to talk about why overfunctioning harms your mental health. And I really want you just to sit with something for a moment, because this is the part where understanding the pattern starts to matter a lot more than just managing the symptoms. So, overfunctioning doesn't just make you tired. It does something far more specific than that. It creates a version of you that has no off switch. A version of you that's permanently available, permanently responsible, and permanently unable to receive the kind of care and support that you quietly give to everyone else. And over time, that creates a very particular kind of psychological damage that is slow, cumulative, and very easy to miss, until it eventually becomes impossible to ignore. So let's start with the cycle, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So, you overfunction, as in you take on more, you manage more, you absorb more. That generates exhaustion. The exhaustion generates resentment, because at some level, you know that the load isn't distributed fairly, even if you've never actually said it out loud. The resentment then generates guilt, because you love these people, or you chose this role, or you tell yourself that nobody's forcing you to do what you do. And the guilt drives you straight back into doing more, because doing more is how you manage the guilt, and it's how you reassure yourself that you're a good person. Plus, it's how you avoid the discomfort of actually sitting with feelings that have nowhere else to go. And round and round and round the cycle goes indefinitely until something breaks. Here's the thing. You're not holding everything together because you're strong. You're holding everything together because somewhere along the way, you learned that it wasn't safe to put it down. That may have been in childhood, maybe in a home where you had to be the capable one, or where learning to be competent was the thing that kept you okay. It might have been a relationship where stepping back felt dangerous, where your worth was conditional on your usefulness. Or it might have been so gradual that you just genuinely cannot even point to a moment when it started. But the result is the same. Being the one who holds it all together stopped being something that you do, and it became something you are. And that distinction between doing and being is everything. Because overfunctioning is not a character trait. It's a coping strategy. It's something that your nervous system learned to do in response to an environment where doing less felt unsafe. Which means it made sense once. It may have even protected you once. But protection strategies have a shelf life. And when they outlive their usefulness, that's when they stop being protective and start being destructive. Let's talk honestly about what this actually costs you, because I think this is the part that often goes unnamed, and naming it matters. The first cost is to your relationships. When you overfunction consistently, you're creating a dynamic where other people underfunction as a response. Not always out of laziness, not always deliberately, right? Just often simply because you have repeatedly signaled that you've got it. You don't need help. Things are under control. And so they step back, and then, consciously or subconsciously, you resent them for stepping back. And you never quite connect the dots between your own behavior and theirs. Overfunctioning and underfunctioning tend to come as a pair. And the person doing the overfunctioning is usually the last one to know. I know because it's my pattern. And it's only been recently that I've woken up to it, and I do this stuff for a living. The second cost is identity. So when your sense of worth is built around being capable and useful and indispensable, the idea of rest becomes a threat. Doing nothing feels like being nothing. And so you can't actually recover, because recovery requires you to stop. And stopping feels like failing. This is why people who overfunction are often the worst at looking after themselves. It's not because they don't know that they should. It's because their entire value system makes self-care feel like a luxury that they haven't earned. The third cost is the one that tends to bring people to episodes like this one. It's the slow wearing away of yourself. When you spend years prioritizing everyone else's needs, managing everyone else's experiences, carrying everyone else's load, you can eventually lose track of what you actually want, what you actually feel, and who you actually are underneath all of that. You become so good at being needed that you forget how to just be, how to be you. But the truth is this: you can't keep on carrying everyone else's life while quietly abandoning your own. And if none of that changes, then the cost becomes higher. Burnout, physical illness, relationships that hollow out from the inside, a version of you that is so worn down by the weight of it all that you stop being able to imagine anything different. This is something I talked about in episode 300 about how to protect your peace and avoid a breakdown, and that's linked in the description. But today I want to focus on how to tackle the pattern behind all that can lead you to that point. And that's exactly what we're going to do right after this quick break. And welcome back. Now let's get into the how-to part of this episode and let's talk about how to stop overfunctioning. So, you understand the pattern, you can see the cycle. The question now is, what can you actually do about it? Keeping in mind that you're probably tired, probably stretched to your limits, and probably don't have the time or energy right now for a major life overhaul. And that's okay. So we're going to keep this realistic. First, stop absorbing by default. That 3-second pause that I gave you earlier in the episode is your starting point here, but let's now extend it into something more deliberate. Most overfunctioning happens automatically. You see a gap, you fill it. You sense a need, you meet it. You notice something isn't being handled, so you handle it, right? It's a reflex, which means the first intervention is to interrupt the reflex. So before you take something on this week, I want you to ask yourself one question. Is this actually mine to do? The question is not, can I do it? Because of course you can. You can do everything, and that's the whole problem. But is it yours? Does it belong to you? Or are you picking it up because it's easier than watching it just sit there? Or because you don't trust that anyone else will get to it? Or because stepping in is just what you do? Now, you don't have to have a perfect answer to that question. You just have to ask the question. Because for now, for most people caught in this type of pattern, the question probably never gets asked at all. So, start there. Next, name what you're actually carrying. Here's something that sounds really simple, but is actually quite confronting. Write it down. I'm not talking about making a to-do list. You've probably already got 17 of those on the go anyway. What I mean is a what I'm actually carrying list. Everything that you're tracking, managing, anticipating, planning, coordinating, and holding in the back of your mind right at the moment. So it's the stuff that lives in your head rent-free and never makes it onto anyone else's radar. Doing this exercise matters for 2 reasons. First, it makes the invisible labor visible to you, right? Which is the start of being able to do something about it. Secondly, it tends to produce a moment of genuine shock when you see it all written down in one place. And that shock is a good thing. Because when it lives in your head, it just feels like being responsible. But when you see it on paper, it looks like what it actually is: an enormous and unacknowledged amount of work. Once you've named it, you have a choice about what to do with it. You might then choose to share the load with someone on some things, right? You might decide that some of it genuinely isn't yours and choose to let it go. you might just feel, for the first time, fully validated in your own exhaustion. And that is not nothing. That's self-validation, and it opens your eyes to what needs to change moving forward bit by bit. Next, let things be imperfect without fixing them. I'm going to be really direct here. This one is probably going to make you uncomfortable. One of the things that keeps overfunctioning locked in place is having a low tolerance for watching things being done differently or not being done at all. So I'm not talking about perfectionism in the classic sense here. I'm talking about the very specific discomfort of stepping back and letting someone else do something in their own way, at their own pace, or to their own standard, right? If you've been the one that's doing everything for everyone for a long time, other people around you may have genuinely lost the habit of stepping up, which means when you step back, things might not happen immediately. Things might be done differently to how you would do them. Things might be messy for a bit. And your job, as hard as this sounds, is to let that happen without rescuing it. This isn't about being passive or checking out. It's also not about being passive-aggressive about things, right? It is about creating the space for other people to carry their share. And that space cannot exist as long as you keep filling it. Next, separate who you are from what you do. This is the longer-term work, and it's the most important. If your identity is fused with your function, so if being capable and useful and indispensable is how you know you have value, then you need to start building a relationship with yourself that doesn't rely on your output. That might sound abstract and philosophical, right? So here's what that looks like in practice. Start noticing what you enjoy that has nothing to do with being useful. What do you think about when nobody needs anything from you? What would you do with an afternoon that had absolutely no obligations in it? These sorts of questions can feel surprisingly tough to answer when you've spent years organizing your life around everyone else's needs. But they're definitely worth sitting with, because the answers are pointing you back towards yourself. And by the way, if you also happened to talk about this with a therapist or even just a trusted person in your life, that conversation would be well worth having, because it will allow you to begin expressing your needs and also to start working through whatever's sitting underneath the overfunctioning. Okay, next, start asking for what you need specifically. Making vague requests of other people won't work if you're the one that's used to doing everything yourself, right? Because those sort of requests leaves just far too much room for the other person to not quite get it, right? And not quite get it right, which then justifies you taking it back over. So, get really specific. It's not, I need more help around here, but I need you to handle dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays without me being involved in it. It's not, I feel like I'm doing everything, but I'm going to stop managing the team schedule. Can you take that on from next week? Specific requests do two things. They make it easier for the other person to actually step up because they know exactly what's being asked of them, and they make it harder for you to quietly take the task back on because you've named it specifically and you've handed it over. There's an accountability in being specific that vagueness just does not have. Next, understand the cost of staying the same. Let me ask you a direct question, and I want you to actually sit with this rather than just skipping past it. And it is, if nothing changes, if you keep going at this pace, carrying this load, absorbing this much, then what does that look and feel like in a year? What about 5 years? Because the research on sustained overfunctioning is pretty clear. It leads to burnout, to physical health consequences, to relationships that feel hollow, and to a version of yourself that has given so much away that there's very little left. And that is existing, not living. You are not a limitless resource. You are a person, and people have limits, not because they're weak, but because they're human. The question isn't whether or not you can keep going. The question is whether you should, and whether the people around you actually want you exhausted and resentful, or whether they'd rather have a version of you that has something left to give, including to yourself. Nothing changes if nothing changes. And the first change doesn't have to be enormous. It just has to be real. So here's what I want you to take away from this episode. The fact that you've been carrying so much for so long is proof that something needs to change. You're allowed to put some of this down. You're allowed to take up space as a person, not just as a function. And you're allowed to make your needs a priority. So, what do you need to stop carrying? Because when you boil it all down, the most important thing you can do for the people who need you is to stop disappearing in the process. Each week I like to finish up by sharing a quote about the topic, and I encourage you to take a few moments to really reflect on it and consider what it means to you. This week's quote is by the late decorator Dorothy Draper, and it is, "Too much of anything is the beginning of a mess." Let me repeat that. Too much of anything is the beginning of a mess. All right, that's it for this week. If you found this episode helpful, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening or watching, and share it with someone who might need it right now. And if you'd like to help me keep creating practical advice for better mental health every week, join my Patreon. It's linked in the episode description. Thank you very much for joining me today. Look after yourself and make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness out into the world, because you get back what you put out. Take care and talk to you next time. Join me next week when I talk about figuring out what you want, and check out my episode on being kinder to yourself when you're struggling next. It's linked in the description. I release new episodes every Sunday, so follow or subscribe to never miss an episode. Let's Talk About Mental Health is an independent program. Discover more at ltamh.com.